I'm the migration editor at large at TNH. I've been in this role since May 2020. So I guess a little bit over a year and a half now at this point, or around a year and a half. And I, prior to that, I was a full-time freelance journalist, and did a lot of freelancing for TNH over the years, starting around 2017 or 2018, I think. Right now I'm based in Boston, but the 2 years before this, I was in India, including for the first year and a half of the COVID-19 pandemic. And prior to that, I was based in different parts of the Middle East and North Africa for about 7 years. So Lebanon, Tunisia, the West Bank, and Turkey for varying periods of time each. And for about the past 6 years, I have been reporting on migration in the Mediterranean, but also at the US-Mexico border, and in the editor-at-large role, sort of keeping an eye on global migration trends and helping manage and shape our coverage on the topic at TNH. So that's just a little bit briefly about me and my background.
Cool. And so being a sort of migration editor at large is not kind of title you see so often. How did you sort of get into that kind of specialization in terms of your reporting?
Yeah. So the focus on migration for me, I guess, a lot of times when I tell people that I write about migration and refugees primarily, the initial reaction is that that's a very niche topic, which I guess I don't think about it that way because it's sort of become my whole professional life. But I guess it is, it's a niche. Usually specializations are more regionally focused, Middle East, Europe, a particular country, et cetera. But the way that I got into reporting on migration, I was living in Tunisia in 2014 and 2015, and I had moved there to report on the post-Arab Spring, ongoing democratic transition and the struggles that it was having. And when I was there, that was primarily the work that I was doing, sort of writing about the political process and various social and economic issues in Tunisia. But while I was there, I kept hearing stories about things that were happening in the south of Tunisia related to migration. In 2014, the number of people crossing the central Mediterranean had increased to a little bit over 100,000. And there were just a tremendous number of people who were dying attempting the journey. But migration in the Mediterranean hadn't quite had that breakthrough moment. Maybe depending on where you are, it might have had the breakthrough. If you were in Italy, for example, it had definitely already had the breakthrough moment. But I think sort of globally, migration in the Mediterranean didn't really become, the biggest news story in the world that it was for a brief period of time, until 2015, when the Eastern Mediterranean route and more than 1 million, primarily Syrian refugees crossed from Turkey into Europe. But when I was in Tunisia, I kept hearing these stories about, like fishermen in the south of Tunisia who were rescuing people on their boats, or I would talk to somebody from the International Committee for the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, and they would tell me that they were running trainings for the same fishermen to, teach them how to manage dead bodies, because there were so many shipwrecks happening that the fishermen would go out to fish, but instead they would end up running into corpses that were just like floating in the Mediterranean. And so there were these, incredibly sort of stark images that until you get a little bit closer to it, it's like, it sounds, it's just hard to believe. It sounds, I found myself initially being incredulous that this was actually happening. So so at some point I was on a reporting trip in the south of Tunisia, I think in April or March of 2015. And I was reporting on something not migration related, but I was supposed to meet the head of the Tunisian Red Crescent in particular governorate of Tunisia that borders Libya. In the morning, I was supposed to meet him. I called him on the phone. He was like, "Hey, look, I'm really sorry. I'm not going to be able to make the meeting because the Tunisian Coast Guard just rescued about 100 asylum seekers and migrants, and I have to go to the port to oversee the process of giving them food and dry clothing and that kind of stuff." He was like, "So we can either postpone our meeting till tomorrow, or if you want, you can come meet me at the port and just come with me and sort of see what's going on here." And being a journalist, I was like, okay, this sounds like it could be a story. So, and I have no idea really what's going on. So I drove to the port and I met him, and we walked in to the port complex, and there was this big, it was this beautiful sunny morning, spring morning in the south of Tunisia, and there was this big warehouse at the port, and outside there were just the blue jeans of all of the people who had been on this boat that was rescued, lined up, drying in the sun. And as I walked up, somebody opened the door to this warehouse, and there were 100 people inside who had several hours earlier been rescued from one of these boats. And I started talking to some of them, and I still remember the first person I talked to. His name was Muhammad Ali. He was a Somali, 18-year-old Somali who had diabetes, and he was, his father had been assassinated in Mogadishu, and he was trying to make it to Europe. And he told me his whole story. And so that was sort of the breakthrough moment for me, where what was happening in the Mediterranean came into focus, and from there the stories just started to snowball until it became my entire focus, which it sort of continues to be now.
Related to that, you do a lot of have done a lot of sort of freelance work. Has it always been easy to get sort of interest from media outlets, especially sort of mainstream media, to get them interested in and covering these kind of issues?
It's ebbed and flowed, really, in terms of the amount of attention that is being paid to the topic overall. In 2015, 2016, it was pretty easy to get people interested, because in those years, migration was arguably the biggest story in the world for a period of time at least. And then, but prior to working for TNH, or freelancing for TNH a lot, I was working with a lot of US based outlets. And so after 2016, a lot of US outlets became sort of intensely myopically focused on everything having to do with Trump, which migration and refugees are sort of part of the Trump story, not an insignificant part of the Trump story, but not being reported from outside the US, outside of the lens of sort of domestic political interests in the US. It was not a topic that people had so much interest for. So there was a period of time where it was harder to sort of get US publications to be interested in the stories. And then after like a year or two of Trump, it was like, oh wow, we've got become so myopically focused on this topic. Maybe we need some reporting from the rest of the world also. And so it opened up again, but it was really sort of an ebb and flow. And again, as now, I mean, TNH sort of became a home for my work, because there's a consistent interest here in the topic. But looking at outlets outside of TNH, you can sort of see the same ebb and flow. The last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of interest in the topic because of the EU Belarus situation that's been going on since the summer. and the horrible shipwreck that happened in the English Channel, just like a week or 10 days ago. So you see sort of these like peaks and troughs and interest in the coverage, but the thing is, it's an ongoing phenomenon that the dynamics of it haven't changed that much, which is hard to get people to sort of have maintained people as in editors at publications who choose what coverage there is, to have sustained interest in. There was one point I was talking to an editor from a publication in New York, probably in 2016 or 2017, and I was based in Lebanon at the time, and talking about different story ideas I had that were Syrian refugee related. And he was like, look, like, just to be completely honest with you, we've done so much on this already that unless it is something that's like truly just like cinematic in terms of the narrative arc, or like nobody's ever heard before, like we're probably not going to commission anything on this topic for like a while. So which is one of several reasons that I ended up working a lot with TNH. 2017, 2018, I started pitching articles, and we just established a really strong working relationship where sort of my interests in reporting and the interests of TNH as an outlet overlapped.
I'm wondering if you could maybe describe the latest project a bit, but I wonder how you got, how you came up with that idea, and like what exactly you were aiming for when you started it.
Yeah.
I'll put a link in the chat too, and everyone else feel free to put questions in the chat as well. Sorry, go on, Eric. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. So this the project that Whitney is talking about is this interactive guide to the migration control system in the Central Mediterranean that the EU has sort of backed and helped to construct over the course of the last handful of years. And the idea, it came from sort of a series of conversations between me and Andrew, who's the managing editor at TNH, about there's this ongoing situation in the Central Mediterranean where every year, the number of people who are making the crossing sort of goes up and down to some extent, but there's consistently, 1,000 or more people who are dying attempting the crossing. And at the same time, the Libyan Coast Guard has become increasingly active at intercepting people who are attempting to leave Libya to reach Europe. So this year so far, more than 30,000 people have been intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard and pulled back to Libya, where they're automatically detained and end up in these cycles of detention, abuse, extortion, and ultimately, like, the only way for people who are in detention centers in Libya to get out, for the most part, is to bribe a guard or try to escape. And when they do either of those two things, the next thing that they do is they try to get on a boat and leave again. When they do that, they're often intercepted again and brought right back to a detention center. So there's just this whole cycle of abuse that's taking place. And the EU has been funding the Libyan Coast Guard since 2016, 2017. The EU and EU member states have, sort of individually and collectively. I guess as I was talking about a little bit before, the situation in the Central Mediterranean has just been ongoing for so long that I think people have become sort of like the emotion that was attached to it in the past just isn't there before. So like, you have 27 people die in a shipwreck in the English Channel where that hasn't happened before. And that's a big news story. And you have, all of this coverage and, probing of, what are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? Who are these people? Let's try to figure this thing out. But in the Central Mediterranean, where that has been happening on like a weekly basis for going on 7 years now, 8 years now. 27 people dying in the Central Mediterranean is like hardly a news story anymore. It's just normal. And because it's become normalized, I think there's a tendency to just view it as, view what's happening as sort of a tragedy. But the entry point for this particular article was, what's happening in the Central Mediterranean is not a tragic anomaly. It's the product of decisions that have been made by policymakers, primarily in Europe, also in Libya, that are leading to this sort of cycle of abuse. And what we wanted to do is just find a really, compelling and in some ways simple and straightforward way to visualize that for people, to sort of, pull away this veil of fatigue, and that helps create a sense of like plausible deniability for people who are in positions of authority, where they can say, oh, this is just what happens in the Central Mediterranean, and to just to show it in like really clear and stark and simple detail, so that people are aware that this is not the way that things are naturally. This is the product of decisions that policymakers in various capitals have made about how to manage the situation.
Wow. I like that or don't like that, but it's by design, not by anomaly. But I'm wondering, since with all the news in the channel, and we've got a request if you could do this sort of story in Myanmar, Bangladesh. I'm wondering, as you look around the world, like, is there a similar story to be told in all the migration contexts, or more migration context than this one? I don't know if that's too broad.
Yeah. No, I think I think that basically the model that we set up, we could definitely apply to other migration contexts. We would probably have to tweak it a little bit in terms of how we approached it, because the issues are different in different areas to some extent. But in general, on the border between, however you want to term it, the global south, the borders between the global south and the global north, were developed countries and underdeveloped countries, wealthy parts of the world, less wealthy parts of the world. You see very, very similar policies at the US-Mexico border, the title for the approach to border control is prevention through deterrence, which I think is sort of a good banner headline for the approach at the EU border as well, where basically the idea is that, and I wrote about this for TNH, I think in 2018 or 2019, about the US-Mexico border situation. I don't know if anybody has the ability to pull up a link to that real quick. The story is called Water in the Desert. Okay. So basically, like, in the 90s in the US, under a Democratic administration, the policy that was developed was basically to push people into harsh areas of the desert where the government hoped that the difficulty of the terrain would deter people from trying to enter the country. And what ended up happening, instead of deterring people, is people who have all of these motivations to cross that border were still crossing the border, but more of them were dying in attempting to cross the border because the journeys were more dangerous. And so that's the context at the US-Mexico border with prevention through deterrence. But you see these same sort of deterrence policies being implemented, at the EU borders as well. The pushbacks has been a huge story of the past year, 2 years, really since they've been happening for a long time, but since the beginning of the pandemic, it's just become so much more blatant in a lot of places. Greece, Croatia, now Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. So this prevention through deterrence, I'm going to bring it back to your question because I've gone off on a tangent here. So this prevention through deterrence strategy is present at all of these borders, and I think that there probably is a way to take a similar approach to what we did in the Central Mediterranean and apply that and sort of show that the humanitarian crises, the human suffering that is created or that exists along these migration routes is not just like inevitable in terms of this is, in order to migrate, people who don't have passports that let them move around the world freely must suffer, but it's a product of policy decisions.
Hello, thank you very much for this interesting presentation and the discussion. I'm a PhD candidate in journalism from Poland. Actually, and I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned when you discussed the Libya situations, you mentioned the European Union and you mentioned the Libyan Coast Guard, but there was also, as I believe, as I was watching, some protests against from the asylum seekers against, for example, UNHCR and the refugee policy that is established there. So I wanted to ask you about the input and the influence of international organizations also in this context, because I think it's not only European Union that is like cooperating with the Libya Coastal Guard, but we have also the other international organizations there. And what is their role in the situations? Are they also like cooperating to sustain this kind of a system, or well, maybe they're doing something else? Maybe I'm mistaken. But I would be grateful for your opinion on that.
Yeah, this is a great question. Thank you very much, Matthias. So actually, I'm gonna request that Matt or Whitney finds another one of the articles that we published recently. But we recently published a first person from and this is sort of on the editing side of the work that I do, from a Libyan human rights activist who has been providing humanitarian support to the asylum seekers and migrants who are protesting outside the UNHCR office in Tripoli right now. It's been going on for going on 2 months, and so basically, what this Libyan human rights activist said is that the relationship between international organizations and refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in Libya has like completely broken down, and there's just there's zero trust, and it's sort of a difficult situation because the EU's involvement in Libya has sort of it's been there's been 2 tracks to it when it comes to migration. One is the border management policies that are designed to help Libya control its borders, which means prevent people from leaving to reach Europe. And then the other side of it, sort of the balance that they try to put into it to mitigate human rights concerns or improve the human rights situation is providing funding primarily to UNHCR, IOM, and a couple of other big international NGOs to provide humanitarian assistance to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in Libya. There's been the EU will also say that they've been putting pressure on Libyan authorities for years now to improve conditions in detention centers in the country, and they just haven't done that. We also published an article, I think in like May or June this year, about how Libyan authorities have just completely failed to improve conditions in detention centers. And so the role of UN agencies and humanitarian organizations in this situation, you know, what they would argue is that if they weren't there, the situation would be so much worse. So, you know, and this is sort of the classic humanitarian argument of, you know, our job isn't to fix the political situation or the conflict that is causing this suffering. Our job is to address the, you know, the symptoms of that suffering, or at least sort of put a band-aid on them so it you know, doesn't get as bad as it could possibly get. That's sort of the classic humanitarian argument for being involved in these you know, complicated settings. On the other side, you have people who take a bit more of an activist perspective, who say that, you know, again, you know, UNHCR, IOM, they're state-based organizations. So they operate in the country, you know, because the country allows them to operate in the country, and their primary donors are all, you know, member states that have signed up to the various treaties and accords that created them and, you know, fund them through the UN, et cetera. So they really represent, you know, they advocate for refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, but they also represent the interests of states who fund them and who ultimately, you know, create them and you know, allow them to operate. There's a lot of criticism of UNHCR and IOM of, you know, sort of being complicit in this cycle, because they're, you know, what from an activist perspective, the argument would be that their presence sort of legitimates or creates like a veneer of, you know, a veneer of we're trying to do the right thing, or we're trying to address the human rights abuses and the suffering that's taking place. And so then, you know, the EU can be like, look, like, we're not just funding the Libyan Coast Guard, we're also, you know, funding UNHCR and IOM and these other international NGOs to improve the human rights situation. The fact that the human rights situation isn't improving, well, go talk to the Libyan authorities about that, but we're doing our part. So the criticism doesn't, you know, shouldn't be here, it should be there. So there are a lot of people who do critique the involvement of these organizations and ask whether they're, you know, they're doing more harm than good, and if the situation would be viable if they weren't there providing sort of this, you know, very, very minimum standard of at least the appearance of humanitarian care to you know, to refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in the country. I don't know, like, I don't know exactly where I come down on that sort of spectrum, but it's definitely an interesting area and an interesting you know, conversation and debate.
Thank you very much for this. Yeah, I think also from the perspective of the current situation on the Polish-Belarusian border that I'm quite better familiar, since I'm from Poland. There's also, I think that at the beginning there was not that many communiques from UNHCR in Belarus about the situations. Well, because of the things that you just said, because there are guests in the state, but also, like, I believe that a few days ago there was information that the Red Cross will also be donating money to help the asylum seekers on the Belarusian side that will go through the administration of the regime of Lukashenko, that will probably not get to the asylum seekers and to their needs. So yeah, very important topic and problem. So thank you for input.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
So I would like to go a bit further on Matthew's questions. There is like African common framework on people free movement from African Union. So there is, like, generally UN and European Union and also African Union, they used to work together on some common interests in African context. So why they are not working together or trying to put their efforts together on these issues, because it seems that it's not only the issue that Libyan government, if there is one currently, could lead with, or European Union on their side, but it's like they need to put the effort together and try to work on it. But how do you see this involvement of another African states on approaching this current Libyan situation, mainly related to the migrants and refugees there? Is there any solidarity, or yeah, how they've been working on that?
Yeah, so I guess I sort of understood two parts of the question, and thank you for asking the question, Mamadou. One is the internal freedom of movement within Africa, and sort of the EU's previous focus on that, and the other is whether there is solidarity or anything being done by other African countries to sort of help with the situation of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants in Libya. So on the first part of the question, it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure where you are, but in West Africa, there's the ECOWAS zone, which is a collection of West African countries that basically has an internal free movement agreement similar to the Schengen zone, which allows people from, I can't remember if it's 15 or 19 different countries. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but citizens of those countries are able to move freely within all of the member states, and the EU. You're correct in saying that the EU was sort of supportive of this initiative, particularly early on. And one of the ideas, I'm not saying this was the only idea, but one of the ideas, I was talking about this with the head of the migration department at the University of Ghana last week. But one of the ideas he was saying behind the support for free movement within West Africa was that if there was more labor mobility within West Africa, then fewer people would want to migrate to Europe, to seek economic opportunity, because more people would be migrating sort of internally. And I think it's also important to point out that the vast majority of people who do migrate, whether it's forced displacement or labor migration, migrate regionally. It's to your neighboring country or one or two countries away. It's an extreme minority of people who have the resources to to pay the very expensive smuggling fees and whatnot to make it all the way to Europe or to the United States, for example. And yeah, so there was support for this free movement within West Africa, and that at some point sort of came into conflict with the European migration control agenda. The sort of famous example of this is in Niger, where 2015, 2016, 2017, the EU put a lot of pressure and gave a lot of incentives to the government of Niger to restrict the movement of West African citizens to the north of Niger, where they were then crossing into Libya, and from Libya, sort of continuing on to, or at least some of them were continuing on to Europe. And it's created some tensions within the ECOWAS system, that the freedom of movement exists up to a certain point in Niger. So that that's a sort of important dynamic that is playing out. And on the on the point of whether there's solidarity or what other African countries are doing to assist with the situation in Libya, you have Rwanda and also Niger, who have opened up their national territory for evacuation flights, and so this has been going on since 2017, also 2017 or 2018. My timeline is getting a little confused, but basically IOM has been operating an emergency transit mechanism where a certain number of people who, were in Libyan detention centers, arguably the most vulnerable, have been being evacuated to Niger or to Rwanda to sort of await resettlement or humanitarian evacuation to a European country. And the number of people who have been evacuated through these mechanisms, I haven't seen, I haven't checked the numbers recently, but it's, the evacuation flights are like 50 people, 90 people, and it's, arguably better than nothing. But also, in terms of a solution to the overall situation, it's a relatively small number of people. It's it's a meaningful thing for the people who are able to access it, but for the tens of thousands of others who aren't able to access the emergency transit mechanisms, there are other solutions that are needed. And then the other thing that that happens is repatriation flights. So it's voluntary return flights, and the question of how voluntary return is in a situation where it's like stay in detention indefinitely, or get on a, again, IOM sponsored voluntary return flight and go back to your country of origin is a valid question. But yeah, so there's cooperation on those sorts of mechanisms, but yeah, in terms of like broader solidarity and concrete sort of concrete steps to alleviate the situation, I'm beyond that, I haven't seen too much of what the African Union is doing, or besides putting out statements about it, or what what other African countries are doing. There might be stuff going on. It could be a blind spot that I have, and can be something that I would look into. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, those are sort of the two main things that are going on.
As I have worked with Sea Rescue, both as a volunteer, but then later with SOS Mediterranean as partnership manager, there's one point I want to make, and I hope maybe you can follow up on that. What I find baffling and really, as a humanitarian, shocking is the non-engagement actually of the classic big European NGOs, so the NRCs, DRCs, and alike. Yes, every now and then you find an advocacy note on how horrible the situation is in the Mediterranean, and then people become very well engaged when it comes about Libya and the situation in areas of displacement. But when it comes to the sea rescue itself, it's still, besides MSF and now IFRC getting engaged, it's still left to the sea watchers of the time, which are often seen as activists, because the classic humanitarian actors are not getting engaged. While I, both having worked as a humanitarian in the Middle East, now on the Mediterranean, for me, I don't see a difference when it comes to our principles. And so I would, if I was a journalist or not, I would be so keen to ask the UN agencies, but also, as I said, the big NGOs, how they define the accountability based on the principle of humanity, why they're not getting engaged, be it financially, be it with stronger advocacy. I mean, I think we all know, because the money they need comes from the EU, so you're kind of stuck. But as you said earlier, this has been going on for years, and the numbers are ridiculously high, and it's not ending. So I'm, as a humanitarian, a bit disappointed of my colleagues broadly spoken. So thanks a lot that you are picking this up, because I think that the platform you are having might hopefully push some of the actors to take some action. And I stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that that intervention and the thought. I don't have a good answer to the question, but it's definitely an interesting question to look into. And on a related but somewhat separate note, next week we have an article coming out about the Danish Refugee Council and sort of the role that it played in drafting country of origin report about the security situation in Damascus that led to several hundred Syrians who were refugees who had temporary protected status in Denmark having their their residency permits revoked earlier this year. And sort of the question at the heart of that is, what happens when the humanitarian missions of NGOs like DRC, diverge from the politics of the governments that fund them. And so I think that's that's a question that's very relevant to the situation that you're talking about as well.
So I'm Farah. I work with a local organization. It's called the Anti-Racism Movement and the Migrant Community Center. So we work primarily with migrant workers, migrant domestic workers, and with Syrian refugees. So my question to you is about the time that you worked in Lebanon, because I also work sometimes with Megaphone News, if you've heard of them. So particularly with UNHCR and Syrian refugees, I'm sure you're familiar with the context in Lebanon, where there's a lot of narrative wars, a lot of misinformation, specifically by certain political parties, scapegoating them and everything. So my question is, how easy or difficult was it to report on the situation of Syrian refugees in particular, or on migration in general in Lebanon, when there are so many sources and resources for information, but it's as kind of a part-time journalist with Megaphone, and then here I work a lot on advocacy and news and fact-checking. It's always very difficult to get accurate information, even from UNHCR and the IOM and everything, especially with the implosion of misinformation in Lebanon. So what were some of the things you faced when trying to navigate the politics of misinformation, particularly when it comes to Syrian refugees in a country like Lebanon, especially in the years that you mentioned you worked here?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, I think, all of those are very relevant and important concerns when it comes to trying to figure out what's going on and get an accurate picture of what's happening, particularly in a place like Lebanon, where the situation has become so heavily politicized. And the misinformation situation has always been bad, but from what I understand, also it has just gone completely off the charts since the beginning of the pandemic. And in a way, the pandemic is so, my response to how, when I was reporting in Lebanon, how would I figure out what was going on? My response would be, I would go to I would go to Tripoli. I would go to the places where the stories that I was writing were actually taking place, and talk to the people at the center of them, and see what their lives were actually like, and what their experiences were, which that has, I'm not sure how seriously people are taking COVID precautions in Lebanon at the moment, but that is, that has become more difficult to do, or at least for a while it was much more difficult to do. And then there are also sort of ethical considerations about, if you're going into these environments, and you could be a potential vector for infection. So there's a heightened awareness about that. So it's just, it's more difficult to do the sort of the on the ground reporting that is really necessary to cut through all of the misinformation to figure out what's actually happening. But yeah, in terms of how I navigated it, I think, the biggest thing is just always sort of walking around with a question mark, and not taking anything at face value, because everybody has some sort of agenda that they're supporting, or trying to push towards, and so at the best, it could be a part of the picture. At the worst, it could be completely, inaccurate. So just, walking around and sort of asking questions. Okay, what's the agenda? Why are you telling me this? What's the interest behind it, et cetera? And then, as much as possible, just trying to get as close as possible to, the issue at hand, the people who are at the center of it. Talk to them, spend time. I've always liked sort of taking a slow approach to journalism, which is also, one of the things that I appreciate for, working both as a freelancer and as an editor for TNH is, instead of having to go in and do all the reporting in 2 hours and come out and write a whole story, I could go somewhere for 3 or 4 days or a week or 2 weeks and just like really spend the time to sit there for a little while and figure out what's going on and not just have all of my interactions be, okay, did I get the quote? Time to leave. Did I get the quote? Time to leave. But like, okay, let me just sit and sort of just spend time with people and get a better sense of what's actually happening. And so I think that's the most, there's no substitute for that in journalism. Virtually all of my reporting from the beginning of the pandemic until now has been remote. And so like a lot of my articles are analysis pieces at this point. And I guess the way I deal with that is I have sources that I've developed over the years who, I know that they are trustworthy people. And so just like a lot of relying on people who are a little bit closer, who I know, are not sort of part of this ecosystem of misinformation and political interest.
I guess my question is kind of, it's a bit of a comment as well as a question going back to some of the earlier points you made about the global state of affairs here. I know you focused on the Mediterranean, but as you've been touching on Central America and the US-Mexico border as well, I think a part of this story, which you started to get at, which doesn't come out enough, is not just the coincidental nature of the fact that we're seeing the same type of policy, inimical policy developments happening around the world, but that there's an active collaboration and an active policy network, which in fact spans the globe in many of the actual areas where we're seeing the imposition of similar, if not identical, types of flawed solutions to migration, which appear to be as well, impervious to the production of evidence about the level of harm that this is causing, as well as, impervious to concentrated advocacy, trying to focus on the conflict that these policies have with asylum, international humanitarian law, international refugee law. So I wonder if there's anything that you've encountered, for example, and any way that we might be able to shine the light a little bit more on the active collaboration that's leading to what I call the migration of bad policy, right? I mean, there's active circulation of shared ideas about offshoring, about deterrence, about the criminalization of migrants and migration themselves, that's actively being supported and disseminated behind the scenes, if you will. And I'm just curious if you've encountered that at all in your work, and whether it's Australia and Manus Island and Nauru, or it's like you mentioned earlier, even under the Clinton administration, the sea interdictions with Haitian refugees. This is a long trajectory of sharing the worst possible practice from the perspective of asylum rights, but yet it doesn't seem to be abated by traditional attempts to create more evidence of harm. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think the dynamic that you're explaining is exactly accurate, that you do see these hardline anti-migration policies sort of popping up and emulating each other in different places, whether it's the safe third country agreements that the Trump administration and Europe is looking at in a lot of cases, the approach to border fortification. There's the list could go on and on, and so I've definitely the Australia model, the offshore model of refugee reception. Refugee reception, I think, is not the right thing to call that, but yeah. So I think that you're definitely seeing this pattern. What and I've come across that in my reporting all over the place for sure. What I haven't come across is, you know, whether there's sort of like an organized effort behind it, where, you know, there are specific think tanks or industry interest groups that are, you know, I mean, on the border tech side, and this is something that I haven't done reporting on, but I've seen a couple of different reports on, and it would be interesting to dig into. But, you know, there are definitely industry interests on the border security technology front, where you have you know, security tech companies who are interested in selling their systems around the world, and, you know, they have lobby groups. There were a couple of interesting reports that came out about this in the EU context earlier this year, sort of the influence of you know, security firm lobbyists in Brussels, and yeah, so I'm not sure if it's like, if there is like a larger sort of behind the scenes infrastructure that is pushing these ideas, so much as it is, you know, one country sees what another country is doing and says, you know, oh, we also don't want asylum seekers or migrants, so, you know, let's do what Australia did, because this is what they did and it seems to have worked. So if it's more sort of like an inspiration model, or if there are actually organized interests that are, you know, pushing these agendas in some ways, it's definitely a topic that's worth exploring further.